I'm Mirel, and it's time for another computer programming video. This is video number 3, also known as 3, and today we're going to code up a countdown. It's not going to be as pretty as the picture that we made last time, but I still like it because things are happening, so I hope you like it too. And for this project, we're going to need a web browser, and it doesn't even have to be that modern. And we're also going to need a simple text editor. And whatever is already installed on your computer will probably work just fine. We're also going to be building on some of the knowledge from previous videos. Specifically, we're going to be testing in the JavaScript console, so you should know how to open it in your browser. We're also going to be declaring some variables, and we'll be accessing some object properties. And all of these are topics from previous videos, but if you need a refresher, check the links in the description. But I'll also be explaining things as we go along, so that it should be pretty easy to follow. Which brings me to my next point. Please make sure you're following along on your computer, because otherwise you'll end up like me and breakdancing. So I watched lots of breakdancing videos on the internet, but at the time of this filming, I myself can't breakdance. I'm optimistic that this will change someday, but for that to happen, I'll have to practice. So if you follow along with me today, you'll get to practice a few things, namely HTML, functions, and if statements. So let's get started. First topic is HTML. If you like acronyms, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And my favorite part of that is the markup, which refers to the fact that we can mark up the document with various annotations. And in HTML, those annotations are HTML tags. A tag looks like some text between a less than and a greater than sign, and it carries meaning based on the tag name. So, for example, in the very first video we created an element of type P, which means paragraph, and in the last video we used a canvas element to draw a picture. At this point you might be thinking, well, I don't remember any less than or greater than signs, and that's because we created those elements from the JavaScript console, so we didn't need any less than or greater than signs. But within an HTML document, we do need them so that we can distinguish the HTML tags from normal text. And the next thing we need to know about HTML is that it's hierarchical in nature. HTML elements can contain children inside them. So for example, when looking at a web page, pretty much every rectangle that you can make out is probably its own HTML element, and I've highlighted that here. So we need a way to distinguish not only the beginning of an HTML element, but also the end. So the way we do that for elements that can contain children, we have not just opening tags, but also closing tags, which look almost the same, but have a slash before the tag name. And for some examples, first, a paragraph that contains the text meow, below that, two empty paragraphs adjacent to each other, and below that, a paragraph within another paragraph. And we can distinguish between these cases because of the syntax of the tags. Last thing we need to know about HTML for today is attributes. We can specify various properties of an HTML element within the opening tag. For example, here's a paragraph element whose ID attribute is intro. And that's about as complicated as it's going to get today with regards to HTML. So for a quick recap, HTML is made up of tags, opening tags and closing tags, and HTML is hierarchical, and we can specify attributes as part of the opening tags. Let's actually write some HTML. This is the part where we're going to need an editor. Now, programmers have lots of opinions regarding which editor you should use, but for today let's keep it simple. I'm on a Mac, so I'm just going to use the TextEdit app that comes with Mac. If you're on Windows, I recommend Notepad, but you can use any editor you like, as long as you make sure that it's in plain text mode if necessary. And if your editor likes to pretend that it's fancy, which surprisingly TextEdit does, we also have to make sure that we disable autocorrect for quotes. On Notepad on Windows, you don't have to do anything as far as I know, but for TextEdit on Mac, I have to go to Edit, Substitutions, and make sure that Smart Quotes is unchecked. If we don't do that, then anytime we type quote characters, they're going to get replaced with so-called smart quotes, which supposedly look nicer than regular quotes, but unfortunately they're different characters. And different characters, when we're writing code, will be a problem. So if your editor has this feature, make sure you don't get tripped up by it. Now, for the HTML code that we're going to write, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We'll start with an HTML opening tag and an HTML closing tag. And let me make the font size larger so you can follow better. And throughout this demonstration, I'm going to be pretty liberal in my use of whitespace, because the browser ignores it for the most part, but I think that it's easier to follow if there is whitespace, although we could pretty much put everything on a single line. So within the HTML element, let's add an empty head for now. Let's also add a body. And within the body, let's do a paragraph, a p tag, and let's add some text inside it. Let's save this, and I'm going to call it countdown HTML in preparation for what we're going to do later. But you can call it anything you like, as long as you remember what you call it and where you put it. And if your editor asks you about extension, confirm that you want HTML. Now that we've saved it, let's go to our web browser and open the file. Conveniently, it is right here. So now that I've opened it, there we go. There's the text that I put in the paragraph. So now let's go back to our text editor and add another tag, this time within head. Let's add a script. And script is how we can embed JavaScript code in HTML. And to be explicit about the fact that we want JavaScript code as opposed to some other type of code, let's specify the type attribute as text/JavaScript within quotes. And for our JavaScript code, let's do an alert. This will pop up a message box for the user. And let's put in some text here as well. Save it, go back to the browser, refresh, and here's our message box. Sweet. Next, let's talk about functions. In math, a function takes some input and produces some output. So for example, f of x equals x plus 5 is a function that takes in a number x as input and gives back the result of adding 5 to it. And we can do that in code too. So let's remove the alert and declare a function f that takes in an x. We delimit the function body using braces like this, and then we say that the function returns x plus 5 back to us. And as I mentioned before, the browser doesn't care about whitespace too much, so I just indented this because it looks nicer, but the browser would understand it just fine if you didn't. After we save, refresh, we can test within the JavaScript console. Let me increase the font size, and now we can see that f of 3 is 8, which is in fact 3 plus 5. But in programming, functions can do more than just computation because they can interact with their outside environment. So for example, let's add another statement to the function f. Before returning x plus 5, let's first alert the user that we're doing stuff. And notice that I'm ending my statement with a semicolon. Because the browser doesn't care about whitespace, it needs some other way to know that a statement is over, and that's why we use semicolons. And we haven't used them too much yet, except for when we put a bunch of things on the same line. And JavaScript is pretty forgiving, but the good etiquette is to end all of our statements with semicolons. So from now on, let's do that. So I'm going to add a semicolon to the end of the return statement here as well. After we save, refresh, up arrow to get the previous command, we see that f of 3 announces that f is doing stuff, and once it happens, once again we get 8 like before. So f is now a function that still computes x plus 5, but it also pops up an alert as a side effect. But let's keep going. What if instead of just x plus 5, the function threw in a secret ingredient? In order for that to work, we should declare a variable called secret ingredient, outside the function, and let's initialize it to 0. And then to make things interesting, let's remove the alert and add 1 to the value of the secret ingredient every time that f is executed. So once we save, refresh, f of 3 is 9 the first time, it's 10 the second time, and then it becomes 11, and so on. So f is no longer a function in the mathematical sense, because in math, a function has to be perfectly predictable. Given some input, it always produces the same output. So whatever f of 3 is, it has to be the same thing forever and ever, because mathematical functions have no memory of the past. But our f over here does have memory in the form of the secret ingredient. Okay, so our f is not a mathematical function. Is that bad? And the answer is no. There are many different ways to use functions in programming, and this is one of them. And another one, which is very common, is for code reuse. If you're doing the same thing over and over, you can make your life easier by putting that code in the function. So for example, let's define a function called announce, which takes in some stuff. And what announce is going to do is it's going to ask the document to create a new element for us of type p, paragraph. It's going to save that element as a variable, also called p, so that it can put the stuff inside that paragraph. Then it's going to append this paragraph to the document's body as a child element. There's nothing to return, so we're not even going to bother returning anything. Save, refresh, and now with announce, we can add stuff to the document. And it's much easier than writing out document.create element and document.body.append child every time. So let's make a few small tweaks. Let's increase the font size with p.style.fontSize equals 30 pixels. That should be good enough. And let's also clear out the paragraph from before because we're done with it. Check it in the browser. Okay, cool. And now let's combine this with our other function. Why don't we have f announce the secret ingredient, which is actually better named counter. So let's rename it everywhere to counter. And at this point, the x plus 5 is irrelevant, so we can just remove all of this. And the x is also irrelevant, so we'll remove it too. And f is totally not a mathematical function anymore, but that's fine. What f does now, doesn't take any inputs, it just counts. So we're going to use this technique to count, but nobody wants to keep executing f from the console. So fortunately, JavaScript has a built-in function called setInterval that can help here. And setInterval takes two things. It takes a function that we want to execute and a time interval in milliseconds. So we'll ask setInterval to run f for us every second. And notice that unlike previous times we used f, there are no parentheses here. If we were to put the parentheses like this, that would mean something else. It would mean execute f right now, and then take its result and give it to the set interval. And we don't want that. We want to give f itself to set interval, so we just use f like we would any other variable here. So let's save and check it out. Okay, it's counting. Awesome. But what we wanted is a countdown. So let's go back to the editor. And let's start at 3. And let's go down instead of up. Save, refresh the browser. Okay, it's counting except, it keeps going past 0, and that's not what we want. So to fix that, we're going to introduce a new concept called an if statement. We use an if statement when we want to execute code only some of the time based on some condition. And our condition here is that the counter is greater than 0. So if the counter is greater than 0, then and only then do we want to announce the counter. So we put that inside the ifs braces, and I will also indent it so it looks nicer. Oh, and one more thing, let's move the decrement to the end of the function so that we see a 3 first as opposed to a 2 first in the announcements. So save, try it out, 3, 2, 1, and we're done. Let's also do something special when the counter is exactly 0. We can do that check either above or below the other if. They'll never both be true at the same time, so it doesn't matter. Now, an important thing to remember is that the equal sign is the assignment operator. It changes the values of things. So if we write if counter is equal to 0 like this, what we're actually doing is setting the value of counter to 0. And that's not what we want. We want to ask, is counter equal to 0? So to ask that question, we have another operator, the equality operator, which looks like two equal signs. So now we're asking if counter equals 0 rather than changing its value. And if counter equals 0, let's announce liftoff. For the final touch, let's start the counter at 10. Save. Here we go. Are you excited? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff! Okay, so that was pretty fun, I think. But I do have some minor bad news. Even though we've lifted off, F is actually still running every second. It's just not announcing things anymore. And we can see that if we add an announce directly within the body of F. So let's do that here, and let's change the counter back to 3 so it doesn't take as long. Save, refresh, and now F tells us that it's working, and it's going to keep doing that even after liftoff. So for homework, we've got to figure out how to give F a break. And the clues on how to do that are in the documentation for the set interval function. So I'm going to link to that from the video description, and you should check it out. But chances are that a lot of it won't make sense, and that's intentional. So when you first encounter a new system, it's hard to understand it all right off the bat, and this is true not just of beginners, but also experienced programmers. So what they do very well is start by understanding small parts of a system first, and then using that to learn more and more about the system as a whole. So we're going to practice that. So take a look at the documentation, and feel free to ignore any parts that are not understandable, but look for clues on how to cancel a set interval. And for testing your code, I recommend keeping around the I'm still working announce, because that's going to tell you if you've succeeded, or if F is still running in the background after liftoff. So give that a try. I wish you best of luck. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.